This is the last session of our three-part series, Shaping the Future of Coaching, a global convening of coaching wisdom weavers. And for us at the Thought Leadership Institute, wisdom weaving really means a practice for integration where we're bringing in unique voices and different perspectives to link together and to create this harmonious, complex whole like a quilt or a brio collage. So that's where the term is coming from. And we thank you so much for joining us on this journey, because we definitely think each of you has been making an important contribution to advancing the field of coaching. So thank you so much for all that you do. And I do want to do a shout out to our volunteer extraordinaire, Sharon Ehas, who has helped with managing the logistics for the convening. So thank you, Sharon. We also have our CEO of ICF, Magda Mook, here, and some other ICF folks, and then all of you coaching researchers from around the world. So this is very inspirational. And again, thanks so much for joining us. So even though this is our last session, we definitely hope that you continue the conversation after the convening, because we just really see this as the beginning of opening up collaborations for future research. So please let us know how we can facilitate those type of conversations. So with that, I guess let's just jump into the critical thinking and the wisdom weaving. And you all know Richard Boyatz, who will be facilitating. He serves on the board of directors for the Thought Leadership Institute and is a distinguished professor at Case Western University. So Richard.
Thank you, Alicia. So again, just in brief, for those of you who were here, this is episode 3 of season 1, as we like to say it in this day and age of streaming videos. And we decided that from the Thought Leadership Institute, we had a session on the future of work. We're looking at the future of coaching. We will then have another a set of sessions on the future of education and social policy and ecological issues around the planet. And the idea for each of them is a little different. For this one, I thought, John Bennett had done a great job of bringing together various representatives from different coaching organizations a number of years ago. A number of us on this call and in the last 2 sessions regularly see each other at AOM or PSYOP or APA meetings. And, but seldom do we have a chance to have a long enough time together that we can actually talk about the issues. Because even at the symposium at AOM or at PSYOP, we're each doing our presentation and then people have questions and then we get kicked out of the room. So the idea here was to bring together the leading researchers in coaching. So we began with a list to make it only invitational, and we cherry picked. And as I said to a bunch of folks, I deeply apologize if somehow we forgot or missed somebody. But I do know that we spent a lot of time checking with each of the major university-based centers of research on coaching, of which, as far as I can tell, there are 5 around the world, Case being one, Sydney being the other, and the other 3 are in the UK, at Henley, at Ashridge, and at Oxford Brookes. So I think that what we're doing is trying to provoke new thought. So we're not looking for agreement from these sessions. What we're looking for are ideas. Every one of us in our, and then I should also say, and we also extended the invitation to the board members of the Thought Leadership Institute and somebody from each of the other family organizations within ICF. There's 6 different companies, and Magda as the CEO, and Joel has usually been here, who's the director of research for ICF. But the idea was to somehow see what we think, because very often we stay in our silos. And even when we review other people's papers, journal editors tend to send us the papers that, are in our specific niche. And this gives us a chance to address 3 dominant themes. One in the first session was things about the processes and mechanisms of coaching. We talked about the theme of different types of ways of going about it. Melvin Smith talked a lot about coaching with compassion versus coaching for compliance, two very different approaches, and have, from the physiological evidence, very different effects on our bodies, regardless of it's men or women or what race or what culture. It's universal because our bodies operate the same way. And then Angela Passarelli talked about neurobiological research and a lot of things that are needed in this area. I mean, it didn't talk only about that, but focused a lot on that, and really helped us to see how if we did a lot more of that, and then the real future, as she was saying, with looking at both the coach and the client or coachee, as well as looking at coaching supervision, we might learn a lot more about the mechanisms. And then Michael Kavanaugh from the Sydney program talked and decided, instead of talking about their strategic focus, solution-based focus, he zeroed in on what he's been spending a lot of time in the past few years working on, which are the competencies. And that kicked us off with a whole conversation, because we all know that there are no validated competency models of coaching. That ICF, AOC, BCC, every one of the groups that does certifications is doing it on the basis of values and opinions, which are fine. But as I showed in my 1982 book, half of the things are wrong, usually when you go about it that way. And as a result, we talked about the fact that we need to have the validation research, but we also have to have better differentiation as to what are things we want people to know before they start coaching, which are easier to develop, and then what are the competencies that we should be certifying for and developing further and things like that. In the second session, we zeroed into the question of what are the desired outcomes. And Ellen gave a magnificent presentation on a full, huge array of different outcomes. And Jonathan Passmore also looked at that. And then he not only focused on mentioning things that Ellen was talking about with the ideal self and one's vision, with people's behavior, with relationships, with sense of well-being. But Jonathan started to talk about how what are the desired outcomes may be different by culture. And we're just not doing much about that in the field. And there was a reason why. I mean, we spent months trying to find anybody in China or anybody in India who was doing coaching research and had published at least one peer-reviewed study. There was zero. There were some Chinese and Indian scholars, but they're at UK or US universities. So one of the things that Jonathan brought up is, and if we look at African, sub-Saharan African, it's a challenge. So we're going to talk more about that tonight. And then Eric Tahan had talked a lot about looking at critical moments. I'm doing a little bit more of a review just because a number of the people on the call this time weren't here. We will be issuing a white paper. We will be doing an edited version, slightly editing down version of the recordings of each of the sessions. And we look forward to being able to help those of us who guide doctoral students, sometimes master's students, and faculty who say, I love this idea of coaching, or I love coaching. What do we need to study about it? So that's really what we're after, and hopefully to spark that. And then possibly, as Alicia said, to spark conversations between us where we might cross institutions and cross time zones and start to work together on some of the more complicated issues. Anyway, tonight we have 3 people presenting a whole bunch of research and ideas and what do we need to know about when we think about coaching people who are in different categories. Not the majority of folks, not only folks who work in companies, but coaching anybody else who might be considered a different or special kind of client. And we're going to kick off with Andy Athanasopoulou. Excuse me, I think I got that right, Andy. Signomi, as they say. Talking about research that she and Sue Dobson did, looking at coaching across many different countries and cultures. Then Christian von Nieuwerburgh will talk about research and thinking he's been doing in work in a number of different cultures, including in Islamic countries. And then Margaret Moore, who is one of the founders of the Institute of Coaching, and doing a lot of work, not just in coaching, but in coaching thought, but now in healthcare and medical schools, will also talk about, coming out of her and their work, some of the issues that affect not just women, but other people from different ethnic or racial groupings. So to keep us going, we're going to have 3 15-minute presentations. Depending upon how many people are left, we might have breakouts or we might just talk about it. But the idea is to make sure we get a good half hour of chatting all about it. So, Andy, how would you like to kick it off?
So thank you very much for inviting me to present here. And I'll have the opportunity to present research I've been doing with colleagues from the University of Oxford, one of whom is Sue Dobson, who should have been here, but her daughter is getting married, so she has very serious reasons for being unable to join. But her spirit is here as well in sort of the things that I'm going to present. So the brief was about coaching specific clients, and because much of our research is also around gender and leadership, some of the sort of findings and discussion will be around that. So I'm focusing on women. Let me see. Okay, so I'm going to provide some insights from the gender and leadership literature and some from our research on coaching outcomes. And then I'm going to reflect on how the two there are areas where the one informs the other. And then I'm going to finish off with some recommendations about the future of coaching. So briefly, an overview around the sort of context around gender and leadership. We did know that women tend to have a gendered upbringing, and then gendered career paths, meaning they tend to sort of follow certain career paths that are more the ones that the women are expected to follow. Example of that, how many females are joining, for example, the HR profession. We all know about the glass ceiling, women aspiring to get to the top of the organization, but the context not allowing them to do that. Another problem is the lack of female role models. And for example, there is a survey run by Grant Thornton every year, looking at the percentage of global female CEOs and managing directors. It consistently is a minority. It might go up and down, and in recent years has increased, but it remains a small minority. So I very much like this quote by Ibarra, Carter, and Silva, saying that high potential women are over-mentored and under-sponsored relatively to their male peers. And one other thing that we observe in the gender literature, there's this, besides glass ceiling, there's another glass phenomenon called the glass cliff. And that is when women and minorities actually are more likely to be offered the C-suite roles in companies that are in financially precarious positions and roles that men may turn down. The literature also talks about work-life balance issues and the tensions, and how the tensions can be in some way sort of invigorating and helping women, but in other ways sort of depleting their energy. The literature also talks about women tending to be more invisible. They're less likely to sort of stand up and sort of speak up in a meeting, and also making an effort, having the need to prepare more than perhaps the other person before a meeting, because they have this sense of not feeling good enough or being assessed as not good enough. Therefore, they have to make that extra effort. And then there's this idea of women responding to gender stereotypes or deviating from them. And then when they do, the environment they might get a pushback from their environment. So it's quite an intense context. And I'm going to present to you some key findings from a study my colleagues from the University of Oxford and I conducted on female CEOs. So we ran this large study in collaboration with Heidrick & Struggles, which is a leading international executive search firm. And we interviewed 151 global CEOs. They were leading some of the largest organizations globally. This was a quite large, substantial study. We interviewed them. We tried to get as many female CEOs as possible. We managed to get 12 of them, and that might sound an appallingly small number, but it was actually 1% more. Our sample was 1% more than the sort of percentage of global female CEOs at that time. And then we produced some of the findings around CEOs, not specific to gender, at the World Economic Forum, and produced a report on that. So focusing on one part of that research focused really on female CEOs' leadership journeys. And we identified in our discussions with these female CEOs that they described going through three sort of self-processes, three self-themes as part of the leadership journey, ending up to the C-suite, ending up to the corner office, actually. The first one is the theme of self-acceptance, and this has to do with women realizing sort of early in their career that they really want to become leaders. They really want to pursue leadership positions. They sort of decide to take active ownership of their leadership ambitions, and they realize that there are a lot of trade-offs in that regard, but they are ready to accept that. The self-theme is that of self-development and has to do with how women work with themselves to identify leadership style they feel comfortable with. The literature talks a lot about the sort of androgynous leadership style. Women compare sort of coping male behaviors. We found that actually women might sort of pick or blend aspects from male leadership behaviors in their own style, but they sort of develop what we call the gynandrous leadership style. And they embrace that. And then the final theme is the self-management theme, which has to do with how women manage their careers, but also manage themselves and their demeanor, and try to find a way to translate leadership in a way they feel comfortable, in a way where they can achieve whatever they want. They can lead and inspire people and get people to do things for them. But on the other hand, in a way that they feel they are not sort of becoming aggressive to the extent that the environment is actually responding negatively to them. One thing that's quite important is they all have to go through the self-acceptance sort of process in order to get to the other two themes, and that's quite critical. So it's almost like a first step in the process. So then moving on to our coaching research and research that Sue and I have conducted an extensive systematic review on executive coaching outcomes. We reviewed 110 peer-reviewed articles on the field, articles that have published studies on qualitative studies, surveys, experimental design studies with experimental designs, and some of the people who are here have been authors in those studies. Well, one of the things we asked was, does coaching work according to evidence? And yes, it does. In very few cases, there were some instances where some sort of negative sort of outcomes of coaching were identified, but 99.99% of the times coaching does work. And then we identified three themes around the sort of types of outcomes produced according to the literature. One is around a person's personal development, and it has to do with them overcoming regressive behaviors or experiences, seeing executive coaching as a life-changing experience, finding ways to sort of apply self-control and being able to identify new skills and abilities and improve themselves, obtain new skills. The second sort of group of outcomes is around behavioral changes in relation to others, and that has to do with coachees becoming more, improving their leadership skills because of the interventions, and improving also the quality of their interactions with others. And the final sort of group of outcomes is around how the coachee performs in their work, so getting a higher productivity, and also sort of being a person that is nurturing a work environment that's more positive as a result of a sort of change in these different aspects of their behavior. And sorry, now I have a small technical issue because there's this sort of thing coming in that I can move. There's a pop-up window, but hopefully I can still go through this. So how do these two, gender and coaching, come together? Well, I've went through the sort of literature on coaching, and there isn't much. There is some, but there isn't much around gender and coaching. And there are sort of 4 themes around gender and coaching that the literature sort of identifies. One has to do with whether women need to be coached differently. And there's a study, for example, by Skinner, who suggested after interviewing senior female leaders, they found that we do need to take gender into account in the way we coach senior women. And then there's this sort of reflection around social intelligence and whether men and gender, it makes a difference between the 2 genders. And although women are better at immediately sensing other people's emotions, men have more social confidence. This is a study by Boyages and Goldman. There are no observed differences among the most successful females. And a similar observation was resulted from a study by Hopkins and Billy Moria. So then that is sort of brings the question, so to what extent do we really need to coach women differently or not? Then the second theme is around how coaches tend to choose a coach, and specifically whether they would choose a female coach. And there is a study by Gray and Gokar who suggested that female coaches tend to coaches tend to choose female coaches as because they see them as role models, because they've been successful, whereas male coaches tend to choose female coaches because they feel they're more approachable, they can understand them. However, when they were looking whether there's a sort of bias in gender choice between the 2 genders in terms of coaches, male coaches sort of choosing female coaches or not, there wasn't any. Then the other sort of theme is whether female and male coaches actually coach differently. And there is a study that looked at work behavior analysis of executive coaches. And there were some differences relating to gender, but they were not all it wasn't just gender. There were a sort of a set of different parameters that do sort of have an effect. And finally, there is research looking at the coach and coachee diets and whether gender similarity does play a role. And it seems that gender similarity doesn't have an impact on career satisfaction or organizational commitment as far as the coachee is concerned. However, there seems to be a gender similarity impact with regards to the relationship, with regards to whether the intervention will have an impact on coachees' self-awareness. And it seems that male coachees tend to find that if they are coached by a female coach, their self-awareness is not improved. That's a study by Bozer and colleagues. Now, so how can coaching help women? So by the way, can you see the pop-up in my screen, or can you see the full slide? Because I can see half of the screen is covered by a pop-up window.
We can see the whole screen.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So the first theme, going back to the sort of 3 self-themes we identified from our gender studies, self-acceptance. So how can a coach help at that sort of process? A coach can help in female talent empowerment, and it has to do with helping women to feel that they can be a leader. So they can accept the fact that they can be successful and leaders, and they can sort of pursue that ambition. And then the second is around self-development. It's about sort of creating, helping women to create their own footprint. And it has to do with helping women to understand that they can be that sort of leader that they want to be. They have the potential to do that. And then in terms of self-management, I think a coach could help in finding a balance, helping women to find a balance, sort of embrace the sort of leadership, that sort of aspiration they have, and the leadership style and the sort of leader they want to be, and believing that they are that sort of leader. So I'm closing with some recommendations for the future of coaching, and I sort of broke them down around recommendations for research and for practice. And they are not really recommendations, but question marks, because I think there is so much that can be studied and explored in that sort of space. So the role of gender in coaching outcomes, I think, is an interesting area to explore. And as I said, there are some research in that, but it's not extensive. So it would be interesting to explore whether the sort of coetzee diets and the role of gender does have a role in how successful the intervention is, and whether male or female coaches are better in some aspects of their coaching. Then also reflecting on female leaders and their coaching needs, what sort of interventions or what sort of coaching approach one should adopt to help women who are at different stages in their career or at different sort of stages in their self processes. Then I think we do need to also focus more on the context, and I'm sure it will be this will be discussed by the next speakers. Sometimes we think of female leaders as one group. They are not. There are cultural differences, and therefore coaching needs to be adjusted to these different contexts. We do need to have like a more explicit link between the gender and leadership literature and executive coaching, and find ways for the two to sort of produce new research. And then in the post-COVID era, hopefully that will happen at some point soon, we have these new ways of working as a result of the pandemic, and then perhaps reflect of more ways of coaching, or perhaps ways of coaching that were not used as much. I know, for example, that Angela and Ellen are doing research on sort of video conferencing as a way of coaching others. So these sort of ways, which perhaps will be continue to be used in coaching interventions more. So understanding more around that, I think, is quite important. And finally, some recommendations for practice. This is a question that it's been asked in leadership development interventions or programs, leadership development programs, and whether we should. It's helpful to have women-only leadership development interventions, leadership development programs, and then I think the same question can be asked about coaching, in the sense of, should we treat women and minorities as a sort of different category of coaches, where we need to sort of customize our coaching in a certain way or not? And whether it's also okay actually to be asking that question, I'm not sure. Then a second recommendation is being alert and mindful in terms of the practice of the contextual and the sort of personal challenges that may be stalling the development of women, and having in mind the sort of free self themes and the sort of needs that women have during sort of different stages in their career. And finally, coaching as an intervention, and how it can help pull female leadership talent up in their career ladder. And especially sort of as a result of the pandemic, there has been a lot of changes in how people work, and people losing works or sort of not finding the same opportunities. So I think coaching interventions can really make a difference in that regard. That's it for me. Thank you.
Andromachi, thank you so much. What an amazing presentation. And, I'm delighted that there's this number of people on this call, and I know it's being recorded, because I can see everyone on the screen, and that's lovely, because, connecting with people is really important for me. And I've actually bought this hat just to take it off, because I think Eric mentioned that. And first of all, I just wanted to take my hat off. So there it is. to everyone actually in this forum. I'm genuinely grateful. I think the work that everyone on this call and all the other invitees and others as well have done have really progressed coaching and coaching psychology and executive coaching. And a lot of my heroes, including Richard, are on this call. And it was just such a wonderful moment to receive the invitation to join this. So thank you so much, Richard, Alicia, Sharon, for organizing all of these. It's just been amazing. And I feel very grateful to be here. So why am I talking about culturally appropriate frameworks? I do think there's a personal element to this. Because I was born in Beirut, Lebanon, in the Middle East. My mother was Japanese. My father was Belgian. I lived in Lebanon for the first 25 years of my life. I've lived in the UK for the next 25 years of my life. I'm on a Spanish island at the moment. So I feel personally a little bit diverse from that perspective. I speak a few languages as well. So this is personally quite important for me, this idea of being inclusive. And again, very grateful to this forum. It's 3 a.m. for me here, 3:30 a.m. But I really appreciate the positive intention of varying the times so that people all over the world can feel welcome and included. And also that you're asking me to talk about a topic which is coaching in Islamic contexts. I've been told at some conferences that that's too niche. People have said, sorry, Christian, that's a very niche topic. Not everybody's going to be interested. However, I hope I'm going to make it relevant for everyone. And I'd like it to be a little bit interactive as well. So as reluctant as I am to not be able to see everyone, I am going to share a few slides. But because relationship is so important for me, I've hand-drawn most of these slides, and I've hand-drawn them for this presentation, most of them. So I've taken some time to think about this. If I've drawn the logo wrong, please don't sue me. It's the intention is positive. And Richard, yes, it's series 1, episode 3. And I'm loving the series. I hope there'll be further series. I'll mention a little bit about research at the end, but for the most part, I just want to share a kind of a case study of the idea of developing a culturally appropriate coaching framework. So I'm very fortunate to have been able to work with a wonderful colleague. She was president of an ICF chapter in Kuwait. Her name's Raja Allaho. She's a practicing Muslim. She's a outstanding executive coach, one of the leading executive coaches in the region. I was speaking at a conference there, and I was talking about what I refer to as a coaching way of being. I was saying, look, coaching essentially is just a very human way of interacting. And I was kind of talking about not competencies, but how is it? How does a coach show up? And what is it that allows a coach to build relationships? And Raja, who had organized that conference, came to me afterwards and she said, you know, everything you've been talking about, the coach's way of being, it's so connected to the Islamic way of thinking. And that's where this idea of writing a book together came up. And as we were writing the book, this theory emerged. And this one has some of the Arabic words attached to it. But I've drawn a version that I'd like to talk through. And then I'd like to engage you a little bit with the thinking, because I think this is probably the first coaching framework that does not have goals in it at all. So this is a coaching framework that, as we designed it, it emerged that it doesn't have goals in it. We've called the framework Irshad coaching, and there's a book about this, and maybe we can put in the chat the book that we wrote. It's called, Coaching in Islamic Culture. It gives all of the kind of the foundational thinking of how the model that we developed is based on, and this is why I love the term wisdom weavers. I'm passionate about how do we connect with wisdom that is already here in our cultures, in our countries, in our societies. So this idea of wisdom weaving has really resonated with me. And, we do have in all cultures and on all places, incredible wisdom. And I wanted to make sure that the coaching endeavor respected that wisdom of the individual and the society and the group. So the first step was the word coaching. The word coaching doesn't translate very well into Arabic. So we had to identify another word. The word we picked is the word Irshad. And the word Irshad appears 19 times in the Noble Quran. And Irshad is a kind of a type of a guidance. It means kind of guidance towards the right path. But we've taken that term to mean self-guidance towards a correct path. And here's the hand-drawn version of it, just so I can give you an overview, but then I do want you to just take a moment to get involved in it. around the outside, we're saying there's some conditions that need to be present before the coaching can even start. And this hopefully will resonate with all of us. But the idea of mutual respect and mutual trust needing to be in place even before we start. And this is why I'm so appreciating this opportunity to talk about this, because I think there's a risk when we're coaching, as we've been saying, difference. There's a risk that we could start off with a disrespectful view of that difference. So this is really crucial, trust and respect being in place. And part of that respect is the respect to allow people to be coached within a worldview that they adhere to, a belief system or worldview that's important to them. Now, I'm very grateful to Case Western for many things, but particularly the coaching work, but also the appreciative inquiry. So we actually have built in some positive psychology, some positive organizational scholarship into this model. So our model starts with a discovery stage. And that's really, tell me about you. And because in Islam, but also in Arab culture more generally, who you are and who you're related to is incredibly important. I would argue it would be disrespectful to get started in a coaching conversation just saying, hey, what's the goal? What is it you want to achieve? You don't know me. You don't know who I am. You don't know where I'm from. So unusually in this model, we would ask the coachee about themselves, but we would expect the coach to share who they are as well. We don't use the word coach and coachee. We use the word facilitator, and we use the word learner, because again, in Arabic, the words coach and coachee don't exist. So we picked facilitator of the learning, and the learner is the person who's talking this through. So after discovery, we move on to intention. This isn't the goal. We're not interested in the goal. We're interested in a positive intention. And this is to do with the religious belief that people are judged on their intention. And I know Peter Hawkins isn't on this live, and I was worried he would be, because he's often said intention, just positive intentions might not be helpful, but this model actually addresses that. So at this stage, we're talking about intention. Then we move on to pathways. This is tied to the work from University of Kansas, hope theory. But this is the idea of, once you're clear about your intention, what are the possible pathways that will move you closer to that positive intention? I think the biggest contribution of our model is what's in the middle there. We call it the alignment wheel. So when we've got pathways, the next question is, how are those pathways aligned to important relationships? And this ties so much to what we've been talking about in episode 1 and 2 of our series. It's actually, I think, counteracting maybe a Western tendency to be quite individualistic in our coaching. And I know I'm being very simplistic here, but essentially the way I've seen the coaching development has been, what is it you want? What are you going to do? Go for it. And this model builds into the process. So it's not an optional part of the model. Is now let's reflect, if that's the pathway you're going to pursue, how does that impact on important relationships that you have? And this is where the learner would explore. And one of these is to do with faith. And of course, in the Islamic version, it would be to think about how would pursuing this pathway impact on my relationship with God. And there's relationship with the universe. There's relationship with important people in one's life, family members, people in your community, people in your professional settings. But also, how does pursuing that pathway, what's the relationship with your deeply held principles, values? So that alignment wheel is part of the model. And then we move into, and this is important, what's the effort needed to, bring your intention into everyday life? So what's the effort needed to live by your positive intention is the final phase our process. And the enormous feedback we had, and I've had feedback from many of the people who are members of this Wisdom Weavers group, was, you know, Christian, a lot of the things you're saying, they're not just specifically about Islam. And that was a real light bulb moment for me, because as I was working with the wonderful Raja, we were writing a book about coaching in Islamic culture. And it came from the fact that we were getting feedback from colleagues in the Gulf region, in the Middle East, that some of the Western models were not, it wasn't that they weren't helping, that sometimes they were getting in the way of, you know, the relationship they had with people and with their faith. But Raja from the outset was saying, Christian, this isn't about coaching for Muslims. She was saying, maybe there's some way that we can share this with wisdom more broadly. So we then developed the model to this, what we call coaching for alignment. So as I say, we start with discovery, but I wonder if it's appropriate to ask you, is it okay to ask people on this call just a question? Would it be okay if I asked you to reflect on your positive intention as professionals? And if it's okay with everyone, it would be lovely if you could type in the chat box what your positive intention is, because it would be lovely to have some examples. And we've used this model in Africa, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in London. And it's an interesting question to ask people who are used to more traditional Western coaching models, because sometimes people say to me, my intention is to become, you know, deputy vice chancellor, or my intention is to become CEO or regional manager. But what we mean by intention is what's behind that. What's your positive intention for wanting to be a general manager? So is it all right to ask people just to type in the chat your positive intentions? Thank you, Carrie. Facilitate connection, build community. Exactly. I love that. So that would be an example of positive intention. Thank you, Richard. Free people to pursue their dreams. I love that. Create more resonant, caring relationships. Give value to those around me. Francis, thank you. Compassionately leading. Margaret, everyone realizing their full potential. Isn't this the beautiful stuff? Isn't this the stuff? And the argument would be that that positive intention is usually the thing that's motivating and driving us anyway. And so there's this one level of alignment, which is alignment between that thing that drives us and our everyday behavior. So that's one level of alignment. Thank you so much, everyone, for this. Resonance, Marjorie says, more sustainable and human world. Thank you, Michael. Be and help others be more vibrantly alive. So this is what I've noticed when we use this model at this point, and this has happened after the discovery, which is that relationship building. But now we're into what is it that you're about? We never talk about goals. There's no talk about goals here. Now, it probably comes a little bit closer to talking about goals, but we're still not talking about goals. We're saying, if that's what it's about, if it's about making the world more human, what are the pathways that are available to you? And here we want to allow people to be as creative as possible. No self-censoring, neither, oh, but that won't be, I won't be able to do that, or society won't want me to do that. Here we want to be incredibly creative because we tell the learner there's going to be an opportunity to make sure it is aligned. So in our coaching for alignment model, which isn't specific to any particular group, we've adapted this to say, what we would then ask is, think about whichever pathway you've picked that helps you towards that intention, how does that align with your values, your beliefs, you? But also that key question we've already talked about, what impact does you pursuing that pathway have on the ecosystem or the environment? And what impact does it have on important relationships in your lives? one of the things I've loved about working in the Gulf region, in the Middle East, has been that family comes first. You know, I've had Western expatriate coaches complain to me. They said, you know what the issue is in my organization? They're like, people here, they put family first. If there's a family thing going on, they'll just pack up, they'll go home. I'm thinking, wow, what a blessing. How wonderful is that? So this is really building that in to say, let's consider, if I pursue that pathway, what impact will it have on important relationships in your life? And it's for the learner to tell us what those important relationships are. We wouldn't say, but if for the learner, family is important, if they think, you know, one of the most beautiful things I've had about intention, one person said, my intention is to make my children proud of me. That was beautiful. I just thought, how wonderful. So it was so important that then the pathway was aligned with those movements. But this is an important point. Once we ensure that the intention is good, and for Muslims, that's essential. Muslims are judged on their intentions. So the intention must be positive. But then there would be a weakness if there's a positive intention without the effort to manifest that intention on the planet. So that's what the model looks like. And thank you very much for engaging with it and just thinking aloud with me. I feel incredibly privileged to have this opportunity to share this thinking. This is the wonderful Raja. There's our book, Coaching in Islamic Culture. The process of writing this book, I learned so much. And you know, I learned so much about that faith, but I learned so much about coaching and what was important to me. I'd never tested what are the things that were kind of red lines for me when it came to coaching. And for me, that was choice. I was saying, if we're not respecting the choice of the learner throughout the process, then it's not coaching. So it was a tough thing to write. And there were points where I thought, we're not going to be able to write this. And we would meet regularly. This is us in Doha, Qatar. We would meet every 3 months because we couldn't do this virtually. And in terms of the research, of course, very early days, we've trialed it in different places, but we have done a qualitative study. And I do know there's a bias against qualitative research in some quarters, but I think with coaching, it's appropriate that we're coaching. The experience of coaching is so personal, so human, so subjective that I would argue for more qualitative research. But how do Emirati Muslims experience coaching? That's published in the Middle East Journal of Positive Psychology. We spoke at a conference about, and I'm like you, Andromachi, I'm not sure whether there is the need for an indigenous coaching psychology or indigenous positive psychology. But I think it's worth asking the question, and we did that, and we wrote that up. That's in the Coaching Psychologist. I'm very fortunate that there's a global charity that took the coaching for alignment, so not the religious version, but they took coaching for alignment because they said most of our people are passionate, they want to make a difference to the world, but they're saying that they don't feel aligned. So we've tried using that, and that's submitted to the International Journal of Evidence-Based Coaching and Mentoring. And the latest study I'm working on with a current student of mine is coaching Muslims on their intentions, and that uses the Irshad framework. And we're going to get some perceptions of Muslims who are coached in this way. So again, thank you so much for kind of engaging with this. I'm really interested in anything you have to say. I want to learn from others. I talked about 2 levels of alignment. One is alignment with my intentions. The other is alignment with the ecosystem or relationships around me. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Richard. I'll start with my slides. So Christian, I can't compete. I'm amazed that you're so awake at 3:30 in the morning. And I also feel just this immense gratitude to ICF and Richard for convening us all. There does feel like a wholeness in everything that we all bring together. And it is something where the sum is greater than the parts. And I look forward to seeing where that takes us. So thank you, everybody, for pulling us together. I thought, I think everyone here knows me from the Institute of Coaching, but I have another life. And I want to just flash that up for a second, because it kind of explains how I'm looking at this topic. And Richard, I just want to say, I'm so glad that you didn't give me the climate change topic. Because the topic that you did assign to those of us at the Institute, this was new for me. So I had to go, dig around and think about it a good deal. And I think climate change would have been a lot harder. So thank you for that. So I grew up in the biotechnology industry. So for 17 years, I was leading research and development teams. So I'm an MBA, but and a biologist. And so when I got into coaching in 2000, my vision, I didn't intend to become a coach initially. My vision was to build a coaching profession in healthcare. So I viewed coaching as a way of realizing the potential of helping people take better care of their health and wellness. So I started a school. We built a protocol. Richard, I didn't know you then, but it looks a lot like intentional change theory. It's a vision-based, but it was done independently, based on self-determination theory, transtheoretical model, a whole bunch of models. And the school has now trained 13,000 coaches in 50 countries. We have a peer-reviewed medical textbook called the Coaching Psychology Manual. So the coaching techniques were science-based, and then now there are a dozen peer-reviewed studies with more than 100,000 coaching visits across a whole bunch of dimensions. So that was starting with building a protocol and getting to the evidence. And then we started the Institute, and then I gathered together the field 10 years later, and we partnered with the National Board of Medical Examiners. We now have a National Board certification for health and wellness coaching, and a whole literature base. I led the team that's built a compendium of all the literature. We have more than 110 randomized controlled studies. The American Medical Association has now approved billing codes for coaching based on all of our work. I'm actually at the CPT panel in 2 weeks, advocating for these codes. And then I'm now leading the reimbursement effort for getting these codes reimbursed and building jobs in healthcare. So I say all that because for me, and that's why I mentioned in our last session, for me, coaching is all about having a vision to change the world. And that's the mechanism for doing that. And David Peterson, I always remember you saying years ago that you pick coaching because it gets the job done that you want to get done. If there was something that worked better, you'd do something else. And I really resonate with that. So then moving to the topic of coaching folks who are in the minority, non-dominant. The vision for me is that we're helping people reach their full potential, and that the context matters. Christian, you've explained beautifully how when you bring coaching to a different culture, the culture has a huge impact on how you view coaching. So that's the bottom line. So there's a new documentary by Netflix that came out in August called Count Me In. And it's about drummers, rock drummers. And there are three, I think, white and Black women rock drummers. So think about that. What if we were coaching women, Black or white, who wanted to become rock drummers? Just consider what they're up against. I mean, imagine them coming on stage at the Rolling Stones or Pink Floyd or whoever, and there's a woman, and you couldn't help but just think about how significant their challenges are to get there. And I start here because I just want us to take in what this is about. When you are stepping into a role that is completely outside cultural expectations, what you're really up against. And what you see in the documentary, what I saw, and it was hard to see, that they were great drummers, but you could feel that they were still held back by their gender, that it wasn't, that it was, and that was my interpretation. So So, that's really what we're talking about is people who are truly held back by cultural considerations. Thanks to Angie, who sent me this article about women in the workplace that McKinsey put together last year. And so what I just want to point to is that, so this is white men of color, white women, women of color, from entry level to C-suite, and what the numbers have done in the last 5 years. So basically between 2015 and 2020, the number of women in C-suite and SVP levels have grown, by a few percent, 22%, 18%, so significant. And then, so in terms of considerations then, here's what McKinsey says now. Due to challenges created by the COVID-19 crisis, as many as 2 million women are considering taking a leave of absence or leaving the workforce altogether. So all this progress could well be erased. So today, if we're not thinking about the impact of COVID, we're missing some of the social context. Pierre Bourdieu has this beautiful framework, and he describes this construct of capitals. So those are economic, education, social, cultural, things that are part of your family and upbringing. And then as you move into adulthood and organizations, just the differential of access to capitals, and non-dominant leaders truly have less access to capital. So they're way behind. Like at 21 years old, you're already way behind in terms of access to the social networks, the financial, the education. And his the authors who wrote an article about this relative to leadership development said that we really do need to be customizing leadership development to those particular circumstances. You can't just impose what you've got. So you've got to think deeply about the impact of the entirety of their influences. Again, back to Angie. I don't think this article is published yet, Angie, but there's, in fact, I think maybe the construct came from McKinsey and others, but this idea of there's a broken rung. So when women become mothers, the ladder breaks, and they suffer their biases, expectations as mothers. They are really thinking differently about their career preferences. And if you don't help them manage that transition into working motherhood, they can fall off the ladder. So that's another different context for coaching. When just after George Floyd died, I set the intention to help out in communities of color, and that's opened up a lot of different projects. But one of them is I'm working with 25 police leaders, Asian and Black, at the Met Police in London. It's a long story how I came from Boston to London. And as I started that work, I dove into all the issues around bias and racism, et cetera. And I came across Pragya Agarwal's book on unconscious bias, which I highly recommend. It is a tour de force of all the literature around this. And this is, I've presented this slide in many places. So basically the brain creates categories. One of the biggest categories we create, if not the biggest, is our identities. Our identities want confirmation, so then we hang out with our in-groups, and then by virtue of having in-groups, you have out-groups. And then what happens to the out-groups? A lot happens to the out-groups. Painful things happen. Their categories judged, slighted, disrespected. They don't feel they belong. Their self-esteem takes a hit. They are afraid of discrimination. They have huge amounts of stress and anxiety. They get sick. Black men have higher rates of heart disease, cancer, as a result of the stress of being in the out-group. The biases become self-fulfilling. Your competence and confidence are impaired. You have less access to resources and opportunities, and you don't reach your full potential. So if we're working with these populations, if we don't really understand what it's like to be in an out-group, we're missing a good deal of the context. This is an interesting paper I bumped into called about the risk tax. So interviews with women and top women and minority leaders suggest they pay a risk task to achieve career mobility. So actively pursuing high risk assignments in order to stand out. So you take on much tougher assignments, and it's precarious because you get more scrutiny, you make a misstep, your career is derailed, and there's a huge amount of strain on you. And so this risk task, combined with having a high standard of perfection, contributes to fatigue and increases leaders' desire to exit their organizations. So you almost kill yourself, metaphorically, in order to stand out. So that's an expensive price. Black women leaders and racial microaggressions. This is a paper about all the things that Black women deal with and then how they cope. And those of us who are not experiencing those microaggressions, and if we're coaching those folks, we really do need to understand what that feels like. We need to bring that understanding into coaching. Then Christian, this is a paper you didn't mention. This is pandemic impact, and so there is a literature now around coaching during the pandemic. And what do we need to know here is that the pandemic has affected populations in very different ways. Some of us are thriving as a result of the pandemic, where others are, whole industries are going down. The inequities in COVID impact, the burnout. I coach a lot in the healthcare space. The burnout of physicians and healthcare providers is catastrophic at this point. The mental health, we all need to know a lot more about mental health than we ever used to. There's long COVID, career disruption, and certainly coaching is showing impact in positive impact in helping people address the pandemic, improve their awareness, improve their resources, renew their energy, and increase their confidence. So these are 4 books, all with many chapters and many scholars just on women in leadership. And as I was looking at all these books and beginning to scratch the surface, because I have to admit, even though I'm coaching women leaders, I have not read all these textbooks. And I'm not sure many of us as coaches who work with women leaders have read all the scholarly work. And so that really speaks to the fact that, we have a lot more opportunity to help ourselves as coaches and others be far better informed about, the much bigger fields than coaching and the much bigger literature that is tangential and next door to the work that we're doing. And Eric's not here tonight, but he and Sue Bonnie, what's her first name? Bonnie? Well, I'm sorry, it's a bit late. I'm forgetting her first name. But anyway, they have a nice study. So back into my world, the pharma world, healthcare world, they did a study of 200 women managers in one big multinational in 20 countries, talking about the gendered organization. And what very quickly, some of the barriers were, and this really comes across. So having been in the biotech industry and lived in 4 countries, it's really tough for women to be senior in global countries, because you got to move countries. You got to take, and a lot of people don't have the ability to change countries with family roles. That sponsorship is very inconsistent, and women often don't have adequate networks. And certainly coaching, both individual and group coaching was used in this study, improve efficacy and social support. So there are very specific circumstances, again, for women in global organizations that wouldn't necessarily happen in other industries. This is just brand new out in HBR. DoorDash has a program for women of color, and they call it the Elevate program. And it's in its 4th cohort, and it's a mix of things. So this speaks to the fact that if we're going to actually tackle helping people reach full potential with all these kind of disadvantages in their social context, it's going to take more than coaching. And so in this program, there's coaching, there's sponsors, there's workshops, these women of color are attending leadership meetings that they wouldn't normally get access to. And the 6-month program is significantly increasing promotions, improving their ability to navigate their careers, and also they're getting more recommendations for more career opportunities. So this is another example of a program. So then what are the implications of thinking more broadly about where coaching sits in this kind of universe of helping people self-determine? I think it calls all of us coaches to get way more informed about the context. The family implications, the bias implications. I didn't really get into trauma, but if you're working in Black populations, you really do need to understand the legacy trauma from hundreds of years ago to the traumas of today. The leadership issues in these different populations in pandemic. And what struck me is that we could be doing more to collaborate across domains. So, Andy, you mentioned this as well. We really ought to be building bridges to the scholars in other fields and partnering to study, integrating their knowledge with our knowledge. That it will take back to the women who want to be rock drummers, it's going to take multiple modalities to support them. So coaching is really ideally embedded in a package, and that the identity of leaders, their efficacy, their work-life balance, self-care are areas we need to consider. And then last, as coaches, we talk about coaching the environment, coaching the culture. I don't think coaching is going to get the job done if we're not also partnering with the folks that are focused on the organizational development and the external forces. There's a nice review in Psychiatry Journal about resilience that I recently wrote an article about for the Institute. And their conclusion was that what drives resilience is not being rugged and tough and vigorous. It's more to do with external factors that support you, the external resources. And so I think just like if you're coming from a disadvantaged place, doing things that influence the external environment are probably just as important as coaching. So with all that said, I look forward to more conversations about how we can make a bigger difference, but in collaboration with the other forces and the other scholars that are thinking deeply about impacting these groups.
I will jump in because I had the delight of being with an amazing group. So I will do my best to represent what Frances, Sandra, and Margaret and I discussed. And I got, I'm not gonna say confrontational because that's not the right word, but I feel like we sort of debated a couple different ideas and two sides of the same coin that I thought brought in a really great conversation. And so for me, what I brought, one of the things I mentioned was, Christian, your idea of discovery is so important to me because, and I being transparent, have not coached because I'm still in the process of learning as a PhD student. But from what I've observed, it seems at times that there's a process, right? It's you bring somebody in, you put them through the coaching process, and they come out the other end better for it. But in the process of that, do we actually meet people where they are and see who they are? And so we connected with the unconscious bias aspect. But in the discovery piece, it allows us to identify who they are and then also put us as coaches in check, looking at what are we bringing into that environment, whether it's understanding of the other person or whether it's experiences that we've had with maybe an identity that we associate with that person. And so one of the things that was brought up was, aren't we all humans? When are we going to get to the point to just see people as human beings? And I said that, and so the conversation more for that's incredibly valuable, but the flip side of that coin is that our coachees have identities. And I gave myself as an example of, I am a mother, I am a woman, I am a military officer. I want to be seen as as a multifaceted person, because those things represent who I am and the values that I bring and the things that I hold dear. And to tell me that I am just a human being downplays what I bring in my own uniqueness. And so there's a danger there in just viewing people as, well, we're all humans. And so the conversation, that's why I was saying it was a little bit of give and take. And the thing that summed it all together was a wonderful question that Frances brought up. And that is, what is it you are experiencing? And so instead of having somebody come into a room or into a meeting, into a coaching engagement, and have them identify who they are, or try to identify who they are as the coach, instead just ask them, what is it you are experiencing? And so Sandra had talked about coaching people with disabilities, and that you can't look at them as being like everyone else, because there are limitations, that physical limitations they may have, or societal limitations based off of how they are viewed or treated. And if you don't acknowledge those, how do you effectively coach them to becoming better, because you don't recognize the context within which they live? And so that's where I told Frances, I totally wrote down and starred, and I'm going to steal her question of, what is it you are experiencing, as a great way to start off to try to understand the other person within the coaching context.
I'm going to break role for a minute and just say that I think that's so important. We ended our last book on helping people change by saying, we really have to focus on others. It's the only antidote to rampant narcissism, is to focus on the other person and to encourage them to share what they are. But what I started to think about, Margaret, you mentioned when you said something about legacy traumas, we have no idea from looking at someone what are the aspects that they have felt traumatized in the past, and what they feel marginalized about. I mean, I'm beginning to wonder about this whole thing because, in now 35 years of teaching full-time and predominantly a doctoral program with a bunch of master's programs, I think I've met one person in something like 6,000 students over the 34 years who didn't feel marginal. We all do, but you don't necessarily know what it is because it may not be visible. And then some of these issues that might cause variations on PTSD for any person are going to vary. And they may vary from experiences like living through a horrendous tsunami or earthquake or hurricane to fighting in a war. Anyway, okay, another group. Thank you. Yeah,
Richard, I'd just like to comment on that. One of the assumptions here in a lot of the stuff that we do on coaching is that it's all about the individual.
right.
And I think that's where we start to fall over. These sort of discriminatory foundations can't be solved at an individual level. And we have to take much more into account the systemic components and context within which individuals live.
Well said.
And that's where I think we need to shift our coaching focus to some degree.
Sure. No, I thought as I listened to all three presentations, I thought, boy, what a fascinating paper would be to poll. We were just focused initially on gender, but I think this could be much broader and taking into other differences. But there are so many good findings in gender difference, leader gender differences that unfortunately have stood the test of time. They don't seem to be going away, that I think in our coaching practice, we may not be taking into account. So one that is very pronounced is that we know that men and women take feedback, especially critical feedback, very differently. Women, it's more salient to them. They ruminate it much longer. Men tend to blow it off more readily, and that ought to impact how we go about, coaching. Another one that my research is more directly involved in is that we know in the 70s and 80s, when leaders were assessed in their capabilities, there was a gender difference in terms of how they self-assess. That has been eroded, fortunately. Men and women tend to assess themselves as leaders very similarly. But what I've been exploring for a number of years now is the gender difference in terms of when asked to predict how other people experience their leadership. Women will predict very differently than men. They will often see them and their leadership capabilities similar to men, but when asked to predict how others are experiencing their leadership, whether it be peers, direct reports, bosses, customers, clients, etc., they will significantly underpredict compared to how they self-assess or also how they're actually assessed by others. And we've used a number of measures to look at that, and it's an ongoing issue, and that needs to be taken into account, for example, when we're coaching. Then if you broaden that beyond just gender differences and start looking at racial complexities and et cetera, I see very little in our research so far that is really drawing on this body of work and assessing what are the implications for coaching in a very real kind of practical way.
Could talk about ours, Mayor?
Sure.
So it was David, Zoe, and Angela. And there were sort of three themes we discussed about. It's interesting that so far the discussion in the other groups was about the importance of context and taking that into account. And in our group, actually, a point was made that perhaps by focusing so much on the group, so women as one group or one culture, then we miss on the individual and the importance of sort of customizing interventions to the needs of the individual. So there was this discussion about finding a balance between the two. Another observation was that although not just with this session's presentation, but in previous ones, although researchers may be coming from different directions, but then there are a lot of commonalities, and some of the conclusions are quite similar, and that's quite interesting. Although the sort of research they do, the type of context they study, or the methods they use may be different. And then the last sort of theme was around if we do sort of pay more attention on context, what sort of research designs will help to capture more of that. That's summary, but my fellow participants may want to add if I've missed something.
I think Michael shared, maybe I don't know if you counted him, but he was sharing the high level, one of the high level themes that we had talked about. I don't know if you want to go any deeper on that, Michael or Terry or Marjorie.
No, well, yeah, I can. You captured it right on. Part of what I was saying is that when you coach an individual, their context really does matter. And so for me, I experience the system every day, right? And so if you talk about me, I'm thinking about the system. And so if you don't, and the presses on the system, right? And so I think even though you're coaching an individual, depending on where sometimes they're ranked at one level, if it's at a professional level, then I can walk right outside of Columbia and go in society and be treated at a different level, right? And so those are all system dynamics, some of which are about me, but a lot of which are not.
Just to share that being part of the new core competencies review committee and coming up with the new core competencies, we have deliberately introduced this in the core competency 2, 4, and 6, where we say that the coach considers the client's context, the client's identity, the client's environment, the client's experiences, the client's values, the client's beliefs, so that the coach and the client gets a better understanding of what the client is communicating. So it's not just in one of the core competencies, it's in 3 or 4 of the core competencies where we keep on repeating this. So we want the coaches now to take a more systemic view of who the client is, what is their experience in that context.
Well, and I guess I would just, Margaret Moore used one of my favorite sociologists, Pierre Bourdieu, and I think also really thinking about the reflexive gaze and where we are coming into the coaching conversation as coaches and what our position is in that systemic view. So I think it's important, yes, to understand the context of the client, but it's also important to understand the context of ourself coming in, because I might be in a traditional position of power, if you will, in that relationship, or I might be in a position of disadvantage from a cultural perspective. And so I think that's going to be important to have that reflexive gaze.
There are two studies in the New England Journal of Medicine, both with around 400 clients. So,
Right.
I mean, it's simpler because, I mean, in healthcare, honestly, it's so much simpler to standardize things, you know, to have a common coaching model. People are used to that, you know, whereas in executive coaching, everyone has their own brand and their own frameworks, whereas healthcare, everybody's happy to, you know, to have a common core. And then,
Right.
and so it's they're different worlds.
Richard, I'm sorry to hijack this right at the end, and I should have thought about this earlier, but can I say just two quick things?
Sure.
Well, it's actually just one quick thing. I'm sorry. I believe we alluded to this at the very beginning, but I think it's important for coaching researchers to know that the ICF has given a gift to endow the Institute of Coaching's research grant program, which we will relaunch after a year plus hiatus this fall. So we'll be sending out information about that. But if you are looking, if you or your doctoral students need support for the work that you're doing, I really encourage you to consider our applying for our grants. The research grant funding at the highest level is a cap of $40,000, and it goes down from there for each of it, several different types of grants. And we're hoping to begin accepting pre-proposals later this fall, November-ish, and then full proposals in February. So if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me about that. And we'll, maybe Richard, I could use this list to share that information, you know, the list of all the broad list where we couldn't all fit on one screen, to share that information with all of you as we have more concrete details.
Are the research grants limited to graduate students, or can faculty?
No, faculty, but there are three different types of grants: a research grant for larger projects, then graduate student fellowship grants that are capped at a lower amount of money. I think it's 40,000, 10,000, and then also travel grants, particularly to come and present the research at the annual Coaching and Leadership in Healthcare Conference